In honor of this holiday weekend, we gathered 4 authors with new books out. Lynne Olson is the author of Last Hope Island. We're also joined by Sally Freeman. Her book is The Jersey Brothers. Both of these books are set in the World War II era. Now we fast forward a little bit to more recent history and welcome New York Times White House correspondent Peter Baker. His new book is Obama, The Call of History, and John Farrell's latest is Nixon, The Life. Sally, let's start with you. Tell us the story of Barton, Bill, and Benny.
Well, this is actually a family story. 3 brothers from New Jersey, my father, Bill, my uncles, Barton and Benny, all naval officers. And when war broke out, they were on 3 different continents. And my father was set up the White House map room for President Roosevelt. Benny was the gunnery officer on the USS Enterprise, which barely escaped Pearl Harbor. And Barton, whom the older 2 thought that they had arranged to keep out of harm's way, Supply Corps officer, helped him get his commission, had been sent to the Philippines and was wounded and listed as missing. And the story is really about the search by the older 2 for the youngest, although it has many tears. He was sort of a Rudy-like character who sort of an underachiever. Everyone adored him, and they were so worried and fretted, even as he, in prison camp, came into his own and built a role for himself, and he was a moral sort of support beam for all the other ensigns he was imprisoned with. And so those 2 stories run parallel, the search, and really he was fine behind a wall of silence in the Philippines.
Yeah, I want to ask you about Barton and Bill a little bit later. Lynn, so now let's go to Europe. In World War II, what is Last Hope Island?
Last Hope Island is England. It's a story that really hasn't been told. It's about England opening its doors to the leaders and the military of 7 occupied countries from Europe after the Germans had conquered them. And it's a counter to the prevailing myth that was actually created by Winston Churchill, that England, plucky little England, stood alone. From the middle of 1940, after the German blitzkrieg of Western Europe, until 1941, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were reluctantly catapulted into the war. And that's not true, and I make that clear in the book. These Europeans who came there, they escaped, they helped England survive, and then they went on to make enormous contributions to the overall Allied victory.
Yeah, I want to get to the Poles, and also it wasn't just men; it was money and gold and things like that. So we'll get back to that in a second. Jack, everybody these days is saying Richard Nixon, his penchant for secrecy, his populism, and comparing it to Donald Trump. In the Trump campaign, they compared his speech at the convention to Nixon's in '68. Okay, are those 2 pat? Where do you see the similarities and the differences?
There's a great similarity in the investigation and the actual crime. I mean, the alleged crimes were break-ins at the Democratic National Party headquarters. There's very little comparison, I think, between the 2 individuals. There's a little bit of similarity in listening to Nixon's tapes and reading President Trump's tweets, in that you're seeing sort of the unvarnished presidential id, and future biographers and historians are just going to have, down on their knees praying God thanks every night, because President Trump insists on tweeting at a time when nobody writes letters or keeps diaries anymore. And a very slight comparison in their ability to tap what I call the politics of grievance, which is to look out into their audience and find resentment and actually turn that into votes.
Yeah. Peter, so tell me about, you have covered George W. Bush and then written about him. You covered President Obama and then wrote about him. Tell me about the 2 different timelines of history. When we do it day to day, of course we get everything right, and it's perfectly in context. But when you write about history, you step back, and the things that everybody was obsessed with were not obsessions, and the things people missed at the time turn out to be the turning points.
Yeah.
Tell me about those two different timelines of history in writing about President Obama.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, you know, one of the things I've discovered in writing books about presidents that I actually covered is how little we really understand at the time. We get the biggest part of the story, I think, more or less right. In fact, often I discover that, you know, at the time some spokesperson said, well, your story is totally wrong. We're not fighting about this. And then later you go back to do book research, you realize not only are they fighting about it, they were, you know, dogs and cats. They hated
That's
each
right.
other.
Lamps were being thrown.
But there's so much more to be discovered about every president. You can go back to Nixon's presidency. You can go back to FDR's presidency. We're still learning new things. Well, we learned new things about George W. Bush, I hope, in Days of Fire. We learned some things about Obama in this book, but they're only first drafts of history, in effect. The great thing about presidents are we continue to rediscover them, reevaluate them, and learn new things.
Lynn, let me ask you now about some of those countries where they flee to England. I mean, pick your favorite. I mean, I don't know if it's the Poles flying for the RAF, or and also how did the Brits take in, I'm thinking of, you know, Neville Chamberlain, who said, oh, we don't want to bother with these disputes off somewhere else. How did they take in these people they'd kind of had their noses up against?
Yeah, well, Britain had made it very clear from before the war, thanks to appeasement, that they wanted nothing to do with Europe. They wanted nothing to do with the war. They wanted Hitler to stay away from Britain. You know, if he wanted to invade countries, which he did, that was okay for them as long as Britain wasn't affected. It wasn't until Winston Churchill came to power. It was Winston Churchill. He came to power the same day Hitler invaded Western Europe. It's just an extraordinary story. And he was the one who said, okay, all you leaders who are being occupied, come to Britain. He's the one that opened the door. And despite the unhappiness of his cabinet and the rest of the government. And he's the one that invited them in, and they willingly came and happily came, and right from the beginning, they started making a difference. The Polish pilots, as well as other occupied European pilots, flew in the Battle of Britain. They made the difference between victory and defeat. Nobody knows that. Everybody thinks British pilots flew in the Battle of Britain, and they did, but there were a lot of Europeans as well. Polish cryptographers broke the Enigma code, Germany's Enigma code, 6 years before Alan Turing and Bletchley Park came on the scene. You know, the Norwegians contributed their entire merchant fleet, 1,500 ships, to the British at a time when British merchant shipping was being decimated by German submarines. And it made the difference at a very, very critical time. I mean, Britain was close to going under, and the Norwegian ships made a huge difference. So all these things happen, and nobody really knows about it.
Till now. Sally, what drove these three brothers? I mean, they're not all the same, as you point out. Barton was, and I want to get to Barton later, but what drove them?
Well, it's a complicated family. My grandmother divorced, very unusual in that era, and remarried. And Bill and Benny were her two sons by her first marriage. And when she remarried and had this young brother, young firstborn in a second marriage named after her new husband. He was prematurely born. He was sort of weak and not well as a child. And they found a role for themselves in this new family structure by being his protectorate, supporter, teaching him about sports, teaching him about girls, teaching him a little mischief, and it was a bond. And they wanted him to follow their same coveted course to and through the Naval Academy, and they helped him there. And although he did not stay at the Academy. And then by the time he graduated from UNC with a degree in business, but by the time sort of 1940, the mandatory draft had been signed into law, and here he was, not a commissioned naval officer, and their mother, who was this fierce matriarch, wanted her, this third-born precious son, to be protected. And Bill and Benny stepped in again, and especially Bill, who was by then a naval intelligence officer in Washington, and he arranged for a Supply Corps commission, which was logical. Barton had been a business major at Carolina, but the Navy had other plans, and they sent him to the Philippines, and within weeks he was wounded and listed as missing.
Jack, tell me about the original title, I think, of the book was The American Tragedy?
It was Richard Nixon, An American Tragedy, because he really does, and this is not just Jack speaking, this is people who knew him well, like Henry Kissinger and Elliot Richardson. Both of them were struck watching Nixon's downfall with the almost Greek or Shakespearean tragic form of it. This was a person who came from horrible Dickensian background, pulled himself up by his bootstrings, served in World War II in the Solomon Islands, came back, ran for Congress as a complete unknown, and within 6 years was Vice President of the United States. But along the line, he had picked up this horrible insecurity, this horrible feeling of defensiveness that turned into aggression against critics, the press, but not just the press, but also his political foes, like the Kennedys. And over the years, he was like Iago to his own Othello. He was whispering in his ear all the time, saying, "You're not good enough. They're against you. You have to get back at them." And he did wonderful things as a president. He created the EPA. He brought China into the family of nations. He struck the first big strategic arms deal with the Soviet Union. But all the time, there was this nagging voice within him that brought him to his own destruction.
Yeah. Peter, the two presidencies, the Trump presidency, which you're covering now, and the Obama presidency that you covered and have now written about, the connections between the two. Give me your sense of the extent to which, and David Axelrod, the strategist for Barack Obama, talks about Trump as the answer to Obama, and Obama as the answer to Bush. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, a remedy, not a replica, right? That's David Axelrod's phrase.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. We have seen in modern times, we elect the person who is the opposite of the person we've just finished with, either because we're tired of them or we're mad at them or what have you. And Trump couldn't be more opposite than Obama. And in fact, Obama's legacy depends on Trump in some ways. We haven't seen, I think, a president come in the way President Trump has, and so systematically try to take a sledgehammer to his predecessor's legacy and brick by brick tear it apart. Not just go to a different direction, all presidents tend to do that, but to literally take apart programs and treaties and agreements that the last president had left behind. So we don't know what Obama's legacy is going to be, in part because we haven't finished with his successor's efforts to deconstruct it. But there are some things we know. He pulled the country out of the economic abyss that he had inherited. He obviously authorized the raid to kill bin Laden. Obviously, those would be on the plus side. The negative side, I think, probably would be Syria. That's going to haunt him through history, his inability or failure and unwillingness to take more action there. And those are things that are I think, going to be examined through his, through his legacy. He's a young guy. We're going to hear more from him, but there's still lots to say.
Sally, I want to talk now about character. What struck me about Bill is in the map room and knows what's coming with his two brothers. He knows what they're going to face, and he doesn't tell them he can't do anything about it.
Right.
Wow.
Before every engagement, every lopsided battle where Enterprise went to battle, the ships that had been destroyed at anchor in the fleet, and Enterprise with a sorry band of oilers and, patched together destroyers behind them would go to launch for the Doolittle raid, would head for Midway, all those hit and run battles early in the war. And Bill knew about every one, and he couldn't warn his brother, and he didn't warn his brother. President Roosevelt knew he had two brothers in theater. He asked about them every day. Every time he came to the map room, he would ask. And my father liked to say, even with my Republican background, I can't help but like the guy. And but it was war, and you didn't do that. You didn't convey those secrets. So.
Lynne, you've written about Churchill, but also de Gaulle in this book comes sort of age. So I don't know which of the two you want to pick, but on this question of character, what did those two have? What is it? Is there something you can put your finger on either with Churchill or de Gaulle and say, this is what leaders of men all should have?
They were very different. They hated each other at times. They had the most amazing screaming matches. You know, people were afraid they were going to kill each other, but they were very alike in many ways, and they were true leaders. They knew from childhood that they were going to save their countries. They were absolutely convinced, both of them, and they were single-minded about it. And if you look at the careers of both of them, until de Gaulle was 49, I think, when he finally went from occupied France to England, Churchill was in his 60s when he became prime minister. I mean, so they had passed the so-called prime of their lives, and that's when they came to power and really took over, because they were so convinced, and because nobody else could do what they did. I mean, they were both very warlike, and they just were determined that their countries were going to survive. In both cases, nobody expected them to. You know, nobody expected Britain to survive after 1940. Nobody expected France to come back. But those two men were determined that that was going to happen.
Yeah, extraordinary sense of nationalism. Jack, after Nixon, and maybe, well, give me your sense, his character was relatively clean going into the presidency. I mean, he stayed with the same wife. He was an awkward fellow, but, or do we have that wrong? I mean, I guess what I'm looking for is, where do you put the pin in his development? You already talked about it a little bit, but in terms of the character qualities you would have seen that led to the outcome.
Let me just follow up on one thing, though. So Nixon comes home, he gets elected to the U.S. Congress, and George Marshall goes to Harvard Yard and announces that there's going to be this plan for the Marshall Plan to bring back Europe, to bring back France, so that there is going to be a France. And in Richard Nixon's Southern California district, the right wing hated that. His backers hated that. His mentor writes him a letter saying, "You stay out of this. This is horrible." But Nixon has gone over on a trip to Europe. He has seen the bombed out cities. He's had little German kids come up to him trying to sell their father's war medals to him to get enough money to feed the family. And he comes back and he decides that, you know, what the famous Edmund Burke thing about, do I owe my constituency my judgment, or do I owe them their obedience? And he decides it's judgment. And he campaigns for 9 straight months in his district and transforms it. He doesn't just win re-election on the Republican ticket, he wins the Democratic nomination as well. Amazing, amazing story about Richard Nixon. That's the good side. The bad side is the day it turns, the day the pin goes in, as you said, John, is the night of 1960, when he believes that the Kennedys have stolen the election from him. And this brings forth this torrent of resentment. And he decides then, and his daughter Julie confirmed to me, that that was the moment when he decided he was not going to be outspent, he was not going to be out-cheated, he was not going to be out-Kennedy'd again, and he would do whatever it takes. Whatever they did, he would match it.
Peter, did you come to an essential understanding after the work you did on President Obama? His character was he was often portrayed as Spock, as kind of aloof.
Right.
You could make the case, maybe you do, and pick up on this if you want, that President Trump is in a sense an answer to President Obama, in the sense that he talked about being a man of action, whereas President Obama, I remember very early in the presidency, he said, "I like to know about something before I talk about it." Was that his essential character, or there are other people who I'm sure you've talked to as well who said, you know, he could do the compulsory acts of schmoozing. It's just the people he was working with didn't want to be schmoozed. So it wasn't that he was incapable characterologically, but that he, you know, that just was the circumstances he was in.
Well, I don't think it's his nature. He's an intellectually driven person. He's not a hail fellow, well-met kind of politician, unlike, say, both George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, who got energy off of other people, who got energy off of crowds, like FDR, clearly. Nixon, like Nixon, I think in some ways, Obama had a more reserved personality that wasn't generated by other people. And so he saw a lot of it as fake. He saw the whole media construct that he should be schmoozing with Congress more and having them to the White House to watch the Super Bowl as a fake, nonsensical Washington thing. They're not going to vote for me just because I give them popcorn to watch a movie. And he had a point. I mean, obviously, you know, politicians vote their interests and they vote their constituents often, and even if they do sometimes substitute their own judgment. But I do think that we see through history that personal interactions do matter. and that was something he just didn't buy into, and I think he suffered as a result. There were moments where he could have potentially made a difference had he been more willing to play the game. It wasn't his thing.
Mm-hmm. Now we're going to talk about the writing process. Where did this book came sort of out of your other books in a way, didn't it? Tell us that story.
Well, I've written 7 books, and 6 of them have been in some way about Britain and the early days of World War II, because I loved Winston Churchill. I loved the whole drama of Britain, you know, plucky little England fighting alone, supposedly. And so each book has fed off the others. This story I wrote a bit in another book about the Poles in World War II with my husband, Stan Cloud. And in doing that book, I realized that it wasn't just the Poles, although the Poles made tremendous contributions. It was all these other countries, and they never get credit. You know, most historians write about the European theater, or the whole, actually the whole World War II victory as being British, American, and Soviet, the big 3. But in fact, all these other countries played huge roles as well.
Sally, you wrote about your father, who you knew, but then you wrote about as a character, too.
Yes. Yes.
I did a similar thing about my mother and found at the end that I knew the person I wrote about better than the person who I knew as a person.
Absolutely.
Did you find that to be the case?
Absolutely. I mean, there were hints at this. Whenever my father would talk about his time during World War II, his time with Churchill, his time with Roosevelt and in the map room, he became wistful in a way that he wasn't as normally as a person. It was a little bit of a window on the emotional man, and a time that he was deeply affected by those 3 years in World War II. And I wanted to know that person. I wanted to know more about that person. And it was really when I found, my parents had retired to Charlottesville after his long career in Washington, and we were organizing papers, and I found a stack of files, correspondence files, his naval intelligence files, his White House correspondence files, behind a file cabinet, and I found some photographs I had never seen of the 3 brothers together. And in those files, in one section of them was the beginning of this search for this younger brother, which when he talked about it and became wistful in later conversations, you could tell that this was a deeply emotional passage for him. And whenever we talked about it as children or young adults or full adults, the explanations never squared. We just knew that whatever happened had affected him, and we wanted to know more because otherwise we didn't really see the emotional side of this man. So that is part of what drove me.
Jack, you've written about a lot of big characters. What was it like to have Richard Nixon in your head versus Tip O'Neill or some of the others that you wrote?
Not as bad as expected. I did 2 liberal heroes. I did Clarence Darrow and Tip O'Neill. And in their case, I had to govern my affection. And with Nixon's case, going in, I had to govern my, at least, skepticism. And I found that he was first of all, I was struck by the fact that his former aides and the people who knew him were so protective about him. There was this emotional feeling that nobody understood this guy, and you really need to start off on 0 before you go off to right or left. And of course, that's what a good biographer should do. He had a lot of wonderful qualities. There are heart-wrenching moments, you know, in the book talking about Richard Nixon, the guy, and yet, you know, this awful flaw which ended up bringing the country to what Barry Goldwater said was one of the worst crises in our history, and he should never be forgiven, as Goldwater said. So it's tough to live with anybody for 6 years, but Nixon always kept me on my toes. He was a challenge.
Peter, you've written about Clinton, Bush, Obama. Do you have a theory of the presidency that has emerged?
I had a theory, and it's now been blown to shreds. My theory was that the presidents were more alike than not, that we make them out to be these very different characters because of politics, because of ideology, because of the necessities of political narrative, but in fact that Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama had much more in common than they would ever want to admit, right? Different people, but the dynamics, the imperatives, the desires and motives were not that different. And then along comes Donald Trump. And I have to say my conception of the presidency has changed entirely. He's so different than those other 3 that it makes me think that you know, it's not always the same. That there are very vast differences in the nature of people in that office, or at least there is now. And the things that I used to think were the natural constraints, the natural you know, factors that played into a presidency, you know, can in fact be thrown out, and we can be living in a very different world.
So, Jack, picking up on that idea in terms of history and its help to us in modern times, when you're looking at the story of Nixon or any of the other stories you've written, is there, why is history so important? Or do we sometimes overdo it and say, oh, it's all happened before?
I don't think so, and I think that the Trump presidency is like a really good example of why history is important, because, you know, not just in the United States, but in Europe, in France and in Holland, you have this reemergence of the right campaigning on hate. And, you know, there's a famous comic book cover of Captain America smacking a Nazi, and, you know, that was what all of our childhoods were based on, was that Nazis, fascism was, these are bad guys. And now all of a sudden we've got this like flirtation with the idea that maybe they're not. Maybe Putin's not that bad a guy. Maybe we're just as bad as Putin. And so I think history can serve at this moment to be a great instructor about what our parents fought for and why they did it.
Yeah, and Lynne, in reading your book, I mean, the stories of Britain and its reluctance to be tied to Europe, absolutely. I mean, it's happening right now.
Absolutely. And you know, the ironic thing is that thanks to what happened to all these European leaders coming to London, that was the beginning of the European Union. London served as the seedbed of the European Union. If those leaders had not gathered in London, if they had not been forced to work together, to socialize together, to get to know each other, the European Union wouldn't exist today. I mean, they were the leaders of the drive for European unification after the war. And the ironic thing is they wanted Britain to lead that drive. They wanted Britain to be the leader of that unification campaign. Winston Churchill and the Brits, because of their insularity, their historical insularity, said no. And as a result, history was changed forever. You know, we did have the European Union, and regardless of what you think of it now, it did amazing things to support security and prosperity in Europe. There's no question about that. But if the Brits had taken the lead, you know, who knows where we'd be now? We wouldn't be, I don't think, in the situation we're in now.
Sally, in your book, I mean, do you find in this personal kind of story, I mean, these are three brothers who have a code and a view of the world, and their mother has told them to look out for Barton, the younger guy. Do you say, oh, these values are, this is gone today, we just don't behave like this? Or do you say, you know, actually, this seems to echo in our modern day?
Families are complicated structures, and I believe that this family, which was, of course, everyone was facing war and how war changed their lives, but they had a particular crisis. They had a family member that was missing, and it did throw the family into a sort of a higher level of crisis, but families are durable, and they held together. And I think that endures to this day. I'm sure you could find examples of those that don't. But in my view, families hang tough in times of crisis, and that holds true to today.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. This was a delight. And everybody, I hope you enjoy all of their books.
Thank you.